Hello everyone, Hafsa here. Today we're going to talk about designing backgrounds. Now, being a background designer is a specialized job in the animation pipeline because you will only draw backgrounds and not focus on characters at all. The backgrounds in animations are kind of special because unlike frames which only project on screen for a fraction of a second, the background is going to be held for a long period of time. So the background needs to be a good drawing with many details as to make sure that it looks good, so that it is still aesthetically pleasing even though we're looking at it for a long period of time in comparison to the frames. Even within the role of background designer, there are special kind of roles that you can take as part of the process. In general, the main background designer is the person who's going to make the overall style of the background and the animation, since there are going to be a bunch of people making backgrounds for each scene in your project. And there are also the background artists, which are the other people making the backgrounds for the project, who can be divided into rough sketches, layout sketches, which are just cleaner lines, sometimes even liners if your production is big enough. And you have background colorists and a lot of people add in background effects and lighting, which will later be used in compositing. All these types of jobs that you can have within the role of being a background artist are usually being combined together. So even though there are different types of works that you need to do, you will usually do all of it as a background artist, especially if you work as an independent animator, which makes both the design, the actual backgrounds, the storyboards, which indicate which backgrounds you need to make in each scene, and the animation itself. So you can't get away from it. You need to know every part of the background creation process. Usually, the job of the background designer comes first in the pre-production stages because you are dictating the overall style of the background art that you're going to have for the project. But the work of a background artist, unlike a background designer, is something that comes later in the production after the storyboards. Because as a background artist, you're going to need to match the actual background to the perspective which is drawn in the storyboard with the character in mind. In this lesson, I'm going to focus more about the background designer job and how we're going to use composition to create nice looking backgrounds and find how we're making the right composition, lighting, and aesthetics for our scenes. And in the next lesson, we're going to decide how we're going to actually use perspective and details to showcase our backgrounds and how we're going to color them to use for the individual scenes within our projects. So, let us begin. The first step to designing your background is actually choosing your composition guidelines. The composition is something that we do to focus the eye of the viewers and the viewer's attention on certain areas or points on the screen, while keeping the overall shot balanced and aesthetically pleasing with good proportions. There are many guidelines to how we can compose it. The composition guidelines are going to depend on the actual canvas size that you're going to use. You see that a lot in illustration, where you have different points of focus depending on where you put your characters or your background details or any stuff like that when you're trying for an illustration. Now, in animation, there are plenty of guidelines that we can use, but it's actually a little bit easier because we do have a standard size for our background. So the type of guidelines that we can have are pretty standard and are universal in every type of production that we're going to make. There are many ways to compose your image in a pleasing manner with the aspect ratio of the standard animation. And once you understand the base rules, you can play around and combine the guidelines to get more interesting compositions. Once you're familiar with them, you can also completely break the composition guidelines and create something that is more unique to you, depending on the type of scene that you're trying to make. Especially if you're not showing a full view of the background and only showing parts of it, such as when you're trying to use a close-up or something like that, which needs to fit more for the perspective of the actual animation than the overall look of the background. Here I've been drawing some common guidelines that you see a lot in the industry. The most basic being the thirds, which just divides your screen and gives you a bunch of points of focus. The cross and the X guidelines, which kind of give you central composition while still giving you simple guidelines to divide the overall screen. A central triangle or a circle, which again highlights a certain area on your screen, which you can later use to divide it. An S-curve, which usually gives more depth to your composition if you're trying to use it with interesting layers. An L shape, which used quite a lot in low-angle shots. The golden triangle, which is good for both Dutch shots and some type of high or low-angle shots. And a central perspective, which is usually used in very neutral shots where you need to make sure you have good perspective and composition. These composition guidelines can be used with or without perspective and in any type of situation, both in natural and man-made environments. They only used to give good proportions to your scene though, and don't actually dictate the perspective of the objects in it just yet. You will later need to fit the objects in your scene to the perspective that we're going to choose, and we'll be doing that in the next lesson. Once we've chosen the composition guidelines that we're going to use for the background, we want to try and sketch it out and give us some better understanding on how it's going to look. Now, in animation, you don't actually have a lot of time to make the backgrounds because you want to focus more on the overall animation and character design and character movement. And basically, you don't have a lot of time to focus on your background, especially as an independent animator. So for that, we want to be the most efficient that we can be when creating our different shots and background designs. Now, usually we're going to make the shot perspectives within the storyboard just to make sure that it fits well with the animation. But with cases where we only focus on the background, such as right now, or when designing the overall guideline for the project, if you want to have reference for yourself, then you need to focus on making good thumbnails. Now, thumbnails is the idea that you'd make a lot of quick sketches with very rough shapes, very rough compositions, just to test and see what looks balanced and what looks nice. This is the stage where you're going to add a small amount of details just to make sure that you know where kind of everything is, and you try to make it in correct perspective as much as you can without actually using grids. A lot of beginner artists are using grids straight from the beginning, which is very limiting. This stage, you're only at the testing point of your background, so you don't want to commit to a single perspective just yet. In order to experiment and have a better understanding of how we're going to design the overall background, you need to just try and play around with cubes and basic shapes and volumeic shapes as we've done with the character design to make sure that you're using the right proportion and have a nice composition. It's also the stage where you're going to play around with your composition guidelines, so it will be a shame to just add the perspective point straight away. This is also good for beginners because you just need to draw a bunch of blobs and try and make them look as if they overlap on top of each other and give some idea of depth to your background. So for the sake of this exercise, you can just choose a topic that you want to try and create a background from and try and play around with it to try different perspective or different amount of details, different composition guidelines. See how you can make it look more interesting. Also try and draw a bunch of different subjects to play around and try more natural shapes and more man-made shapes, just for the sake of the exercise, especially if you're more experienced with the process and want to try and add some more details. Again, for this part, only focus on basic shapes and try and give them volume in a way that kind of makes sense. If it doesn't look very well to your eyes, just draw a completely different thumbnail. Don't hang on each one of them. Try and make them in as little as 5 minutes. And if you're a complete beginner, maybe 10 minutes per one of them. Even though we are using the composition guidelines to give us better proportions to our background, that does not mean that we can ignore the perspective or the depth of the background. When you're sketching your thumbnails, you need to think about how is the overall background going to seem the most natural and interesting. The eye is going to be attracted to points of high contrast, and it's going to follow the lines of the objects in your scene to their convergence point on the screen. This means that if you want to guide the eyes of the audience to a certain point, you should place the objects and details in your scene in a way where you have the highest contrast at the point where you want the audience to focus on, be it by having a lot of details at that point and not so many details at any other point, or on the opposite side, having many details in your background and leaving areas where you have blank spaces. This is actually my preferred method because you want to have a detailed background, but also you need to remember that your character is going to appear on it. And you also want that your character will be at the focus point of the scene. So it's better to leave your character in a blank space and have a lot of details in the background than to have a lot of details behind your character, which creates a situation where your character is hiding all the details and the background itself is blank and boring. But even if you are going to choose either of these options, you need to make sure that the rest of the background also points to the focus point. To do this, make sure that your objects in your background are made out of lines that all point to the same areas on the screen, or that they all frame the same areas on the screen. This can be done using perspective or by using parallel lines that follow our initial composition guideline. This will allow you to frame certain areas on the screen or point to them. Lastly, another important thing to remember when creating your thumbnails is that you want to have variations and randomness in your background. You don't want to draw the same objects in the same sizes over and over again, because nothing in life is actually that consistent. It will not look very interesting or aesthetically pleasing. You are specifically going for a very mechanical and clinical look. If you're drawing smaller objects, you can make some variations in their placement and groupings with the overall numbers. If you're going for bigger objects, consider changing their spacing or angles in relation to each other. You can also create variations by adding different amount of details or different types of details in different objects in your scene. And don't think about smaller details at that point in your thumbnailing, but you want to make sure that even your bigger areas and your initial composition still has variations and interesting looks to it. And while keeping all of this in mind, try and make the perspective correct as well. At this point, try creating perspective only by the layering of the different objects in your scene. You don't need to think about complicated angles just yet. You need to make sure that, same as with our character volumes, you use the correct amount of overlap to create depth, and that the size relation between the objects in your different layers is consistent and looks rational in a way that actually creates depth between them. In independent animation, you will usually only use your background for one single shot, and it will be created specifically for that shot in mind. So it will have predetermined perspective, and you wouldn't be able to play around with it once you decide on that background. But because you are an independent animator and you are the one who's deciding the overall perspective and look for each shot, you have more freedom to experiment straight from the beginning. So, with the same way that we did basic thumbnails just to get an idea of our environment and scene, we want to try and use the composition guidelines to give more interesting shots. Because the way that we're going to make it stand out, especially if it's a very short animation that we do independently, is to make the shots themselves more interesting and varied. So, try and take the same kind of shots and compositions that we've done before with the thumbnails and look around and switch the perspective and angles of camera. Try and use it with different composition guidelines and with different subjects for the sake of the exercise. With this kind of perspective compositions, you want to really focus about making sure that your composition doesn't feel flat. So for this purpose, we're going to use 3 main techniques. The first one is a change in size relative to the camera. So in that stage, you can kind of take your simple objects that we've used in the main composition and just shift them closer and further away from the camera by enlarging them or making them smaller. You can also try and deform them a little bit to create a difference in angles. Of course, the further away the part is from the camera, the smaller it's going to be. And you want to make sure that all of the deformation points to the same direction. This we're going to do later on in the next lesson when we're applying perspective to it, but still try and get it as correct as you can when doing the thumbnails. If you are a complete beginner, try and do that with cubes or circles. But if you are more experienced, try and give more interesting shapes right from the beginning. The next way we're going to show depth in the scene is by having layering of the objects within your scene. So in our minds, we already know what things are small and what things are big. We want to try and play around with it to give the impression of something that is further away from the camera. You know, if you're drawing a house and it's small on the screen in comparison to a tree which is closer to us, it's going to look like we have more depth in the scene. We want to try and shift the things in the scene in the different composition guidelines to try and give more depth to the overall scene. Last thing that we're going to use in our thumbnails to show depth is values. Values is where we're actually starting to design the overall look and atmosphere of the scene. And this is where we're going to add the lighting and later on the colors. First, let's define what are depth and values. Depth is what we're going to do to create an illusion of a 3D space in our 2D drawing. This is done primarily by creating good drawings with good compositions and good perspectives. But it is also done by using camera angles and layering within the scene. When we're designing our actual background, which is going to be used within the animation, we're not going to create it as a single illustration. Because in real life, when the camera moves, when the character moves, The distance of an object from the camera is going to affect how quickly or slowly it's going to move in relation to the camera and the characters. Another thing you need to remember in animation is that when your character is moving in a 3D space, you might want to move it in front or behind certain objects on your screen. So you need to make sure that you have them separated so that you can cover or show the character as necessary. This is something that we're going to focus on the next lesson, but it is important to keep that in mind right now when you're designing your thumbnails to know where each layer is separated. Value, on the other hand, is the terminology for using different grayscale tones, which are basically just gray colorings, darkest being black while the brightest being white, and the entire gradient shifts of your color from white to black with all the different shades of gray in the middle. The gradient shift of your values in the thumbnail will create the illusion of depth when applied to the basic shapes of your composition in a way that makes sense. So, let's see how we combine both layers and values to create depth and focus within our scene. As I've said before, you will need to divide your layers into distinct distances from the camera and separate them to create certain camera movements. These distinct layers have different names depending on the distance from the camera. Each one of them will usually be represented with their own value, and any details within that certain layers will adhere to that central value while still retaining their own local values around them. So this sounds kind of complicated, but basically it means you have one color of gray in one brightness for each layer, and then you can have small variation within that color of gray to separate different details in that layer. You don't want to have too many shifts in that certain shade of gray, because then the overall depth of your scene is going to be less realistic and less cohesive. In general, you can separate these three distinct layers into three labels. First, you have the foreground, which is the area closest to the camera. Next, you're going to have the midground, which is, of course, the middle range. This is where usually most animation is going to take place unless you have some certain specialized shot, such as close-up or partial close-up, or something with extreme low or high angles, which don't tend to have as many layers because you don't see a lot of the environment around the characters. And lastly, we have the background layer. This is kind of confusing because both the overall background and the background layers are called background, but when you're seeing that in context, it's pretty easy to understand. In general, the actual background is the furthest away from the camera, and it will have the smallest amount of movement and the smallest amount of details because you're not going to be seeing a lot of it. You might also find something of an additional layer called overlay, which is when you have multiple objects which are in the same distance from the camera but obscure each other. You might need to separate them to different layers when producing the background if your character is interacting with different objects in the scene. You might actually find a different variation of overlay where you have something which is extremely close to the camera, which completely blocks the view of the scene. Again, this needs to be separated to a different layer, and you also need to make sure that the obscuring object is completely readable, so don't go and put something just at the edge of the screen to make it smaller in a way which looks incorrect or just not very understandable. Also, when designing your different layers and overlays, you need to make sure that you're not creating too many tangents where you have multiple lines combining into a single dot, because this is not going to look very aesthetically pleasing, and you might risk dividing your layers into something which shows a lot of the line art, which kind of creates unintentional points of focus. So in general, you need to make sure that you have enough space between each part of your background and details, even when you're using overlays, just to make sure that the entire composition doesn't feel too crowded and uses too many lines. Now that we settled on a certain thumbnail and kind of added the basic shapes and tried and create depth using some understanding of perspective, we want to actually give it depth and atmosphere using values. So, as I've said before, we're going to use values in the thumbnailing stage to create depth. At this point, you don't want to use too many values. Using just 3 or 4 values is going to be enough. You want to have a large range. Don't use something that is too close to each other. So don't go and use like a whole bunch of grays which are close to each other, which don't give you a lot of understanding of the depth of the scene. Don't add too many value variations within a single layer, because right now we're still in the thumbnailing and we want to get the overall depth of the scene. So don't add different values to different details that you have in your thumbnail sketch just yet. This will come later on when we're actually going to decide on the lighting of the scene. There are two ways that we can create the illusion of depth using simple values in the thumbnailing stage. Basically, you can either go from dark background to light foreground or from bright background to dark foreground. Each one of them has a distinct impression which they will give your scene, even if both of them give the illusion of depth. With the bright background and dark foreground, you will get an impression of an open space, and this is meant to replicate the real-life phenomenon of ambient lighting. Look in real life on the horizon, you will see that the closer an object is to the horizon, the bluer and fainter it's going to get. I saw it in mountains or when large flat areas where they just gradually become bluer and disappear into the horizon. Replicate this effect, we're just going to slowly shift our grayscale towards the value of the sky, which is again white because we're using the white background to dark foreground. The second shift is from dark background to light foreground. This creates the illusion of a smaller space and gives a more menacing or calm atmosphere depending on the amount of gray that you have in your scene. This is meant to replicate the effect that darkness has on our vision, where our field of view is more limited. The way that we're going to play around with the grayscale within this light or dark base background is going to create the overall atmosphere of the scene in combination with the lighting. But you need to make sure that you're not working with too limited of a range in your grayscale. So when deciding on the shades that you're going to use in the thumbnailing, make sure that you have a good range of darks and whites so you can create enough of a contrast to create the idea of depth. You also need to make sure that each distinct layers with a different distance from the camera has enough contrast to be clearly shown when creating depth in your background. Depending on your lighting situation, you might not even need to have a chronological order to your grays. Just having a logical separation of background, midground, and foreground is enough. Now that we have our basic composition and understanding of the scene, some interesting perspective that we try to give it, and an idea of the depth and overall atmosphere in it using the basic grayscale thumbnailing, we want to actually focus the eye of the viewer on the correct details within the scene. So at this point, you try and create more variation in the lighting and the values in the scene to point the eye of the viewer to the correct areas on the screen, especially the ones that we used within the composition guidelines. Our brains and eyes are wired to perceive contrast at first glance. So the way that we're going to create these points of focus within our scene is by making sure that the highest amount of contrast is going to be where we want the eye to focus. This usually means that we're going to design the entire background with the idea that it's going to point to a single area. In that area, we're usually going to place our character because we want to make sure that they are distinct on top of the background, but we also want to make sure that the entire background itself has good composition, which help us focus on the character. So, to do that, we're going to use different lighting and local values in each layer. Since a background is going to be more detailed than the actual characters, you're usually going to have multiple different objects in the same area within the scene. So, if you want to focus on a certain object in that area, the lighting is going to help you quite a lot, because it's going to create different contrast and different areas of values, which help combine the different elements of the background together and separate the character from them. First, you have to decide the general lighting of your scene, which will decide its overall mood. We've done this before with the general values that we added with the dark or bright background. Once you have that, you need to emphasize the important details using lighting. In this example, I'm going to show you how we're going to emphasize a certain character or background detail by using the values alone. So, with the setup of the scene, while both characters are shown to be in the same distance from the camera with their original value, one character naturally stands out more since it's more contrasted with the black background. But let's say I want to make the other character pop out more. To do that, we're just going to create the lighting in a way that creates more contrast on that character in comparison to the background. Now, the overall background is pretty dark, so by adding light directly to the character, we can make it stand out way more than the one beside it. We can try different combinations of lighting and backgrounds to create different types of contrasts. We also need to take into account that the value groups that we have with the background and the characters are going to create different amounts of contrast. For example, by adding a small amount of contrast with the background, by just making it a little bit brighter, we can even out the contrast and create focus on both characters. While if I add light directly to the character which is on top of the black background, the high contrast of that character in comparison to the low contrast of the other character is going to make it much harder to see the other character, even though we haven't actually changed the contrast of that specific character, just because the eye is going to focus on the larger contrast first. This is the part where you design your scene in a way that draws the eyes to the correct areas on the screen. You can play around with different lighting situations to give different contrasts to different characters or different layers within your scene. When you have an understanding on the overall layout of your environment, you can try and make more experimental lighting, such as having your dark background with bright details and then your characters in overlay, which again creates different kind of contrast. Or you can try and illuminate both characters or only parts of them to draw the eye to certain areas which are important to the scene. An important thing to remember though is that you don't want to have too many points of focus on your screen, and you want to make sure that your points of focus are connected to the composition guidelines and focus points that they create, because the whole point of using them in the first place is to create a balanced and aesthetically pleasing scene. So if you do all the lines in an aesthetically pleasing manner, but then draw the focus to a completely different area by shifting the lighting, it doesn't really help us. So when you're adding the lighting to your scene, make sure that the areas that you're going to focus on are sticking to the composition guidelines and still show the actual important details of the scene. This is actually why we only create simple thumbnails and simple values at this stage, because we want to experiment and try and find the best lighting and value situation for our scene when designing our backgrounds and the overall look of our animations. For this exercise, try and create the best composition that you can using values, details, and layers within the thumbnails that we've done in the beginning of the video. Try and create as many as you can, as quickly as you can, and don't think too much about them, so that you have more experience and see which ones stick out to you after you have a considerable amount of them. Try and analyze what makes each one of them look better than the other, and use these guidelines to create the backgrounds for the next video. It is important to understand your lighting situations and how you're going to organize them before you're actually going to color your background. Because when we're choosing our colors later on, they are going to stick to the lighting situation that we choose at that stage. You don't need to have local values and all the details just yet, because first we want to have the correct perspective and the clean line art, but at least have a good idea of how you're going to divide your layers into values and what is the overall lighting of the scene. If you haven't been following along throughout this video, the exercise for today is to create 3 different thumbnails using different composition guidelines. In these thumbnails, you only need to draw the different shapes within your scene, and you need to add your grayscale to create either a depth or lighting effects. In your final thumbnail, make sure that the different levels are made on separate layers, so that it will be easier for you to continue and work on them separately later on, as well as be able to composite them in later videos regarding production if you know that you want to use the background in them. I recommend creating more than 3 thumbnails, and if you want to up your difficulty, try and create a complete thumbnail within 5 minutes. You want to make your thumbnails as clear as possible, so don't thicken the line or make it too sketchy. And try to add different angles within your thumbnails. while still keeping the perspective as correct as possible. If this is a difficult exercise for you, try and create different perspectives using different cubes and spheres as a first step. Finally, choose one thumbnail that you liked and try and recreate it using different lighting or depth of field. To summarize, in this video we've looked at some basic composition rules, how to apply them to simple backgrounds and thumbnails, and how to create depth using different angles, layers, and values, as well as how to create different focus points using lighting and how we can play around with them to create different types of compositions and focus points in the scene. In the next lesson, we learn how to actually finalize your background with correct perspective and how to add coloring in accordance to the values and lighting situation. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye!